Good evening again, Mr. Vice Mayor and Council. It doesn't seem that long ago, but back in June of 2019, the Council adopted an ordinance establishing district elections for the first time in San Ramon. Those first district elections in the city took place in 2020, with the elections taking place in districts 1 and 3, and the mayor being elected at large. We are going to hold elections in districts 2 and 4 in 2022, and again hold a mayoral election at large in San Ramon. But in between these two elections, we have received data from the 2020 census, and that has given us a picture of changing demographics within the city. And the city has since annexed a significant amount of land on top of that. So state law says that we have to re-examine the districts and adjust them to create fair districts for 2022, allowing for the new demographics. So the process for amending district boundaries is similar to the one we used in creating them. This is the first of at least 4 meetings that the council must hold under state law before we can adopt new district boundary maps. And again, just as in 2019, we are fortunate to have Michael Wagaman, the city's independent demographer, to guide us through this process. Michael is here to give us more detail on the process of redistricting and on the criteria for creating districts, and also to solicit input from both the council and the public on how these maps should be drawn. So we will be doing public outreach throughout the process so that we can get as much participation from all corners of the city as possible. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael, who will guide us through the presentation.
Good evening, Council, and I know you're all super excited to see me again, but we'll get through it, I promise. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through the PowerPoint. For those who are a part of the process, a lot of this will be familiar, and some of it will be a little different. Hopefully you are now seeing that PowerPoint. And again, this is the first of 2 public hearings to discuss the redistricting process before we get to draft maps. So this should be familiar for when we did the initial districting process, that we have a couple hearings before we have maps, and then we have a couple of hearings after we have maps, and that's on purpose so that people can actually talk about this and provide input before immediately skipping to where exactly is the line going to be. This will also be an opportunity for the public to start doing that first chance to weigh in, and also the first chance, if there are any things that we have not prepared for you, to make sure we have for that second hearing. Now, one thing that is very different from last time is the timeline. Last time, if you recall, it was a very rushed timeline, and that was because of the requirements of the California Voting Rights Act. But here, we have this first hearing here in November, and then I won't actually be back before you until January. And that's on purpose, because that's period there is, as staff referenced, will be that time to solicit the public and be able to do that in a deliberative way to get that feedback, so that when we get into the new year, you have that depository of information to start making decisions and start giving me direction. Because again, at that second hearing, that's when you'll provide direction to me on things you want to see and potential maps. You don't have to be reaching a consensus at that point, because I'll produce at least 3 different options for you to consider. In addition, we'll have any public maps that might be submitted, and I'll show you some tools we've set up for the public to do that, so that then at that third hearing, you can start whittling down what do you like, what do you don't, and heading towards hopefully adopting a final map at that 4th hearing. After that 4th hearing, we have a map that's close but not quite there. We can go through what I call live line drawing, where we'll actually move the lines during that meeting and get you to a final map. What is redistricting? Again, as everyone kind of discovered during the 2019 process, it's different from at large, where everybody votes for everybody. Instead, you have only a portion of the city voting for an office, but it's only those people get to vote for that one office. And even though you just went through that process, redistricting is a 10-year process where you are capturing the populations that shift over time. And redistricting is simply the effort of redrawing lines to capture those changes. But it matters because those lines affect how people are represented in government. And unlike the last process, these lines you'll have for 10 years. So it's important we have a good process to get them right. Lots of standard reasons why you would have to redistrict, chief of which we've had a new census, which tells us a lot about the city, which I'll walk you through in a moment. There's some little changes to federal and state law that have happened even since 2019. And the other reason is public input. It's an opportunity for people to tell you what's working and what isn't. In addition, within San Ramon, there are some special things that have popped up, which I will walk you through. One of which is, as was referred, the city has annexed a portion of land that does have people, a significant number of people in it. And under state law, when you did that annex, you were required to say which districts did that area go to, which is what you're seeing in the map there. The kind of lighter shaded areas are the areas that were annexed, and you see half was assigned to District 2 and half was to District 3, basically following along Doherty. But that wasn't a part of the original districting process, and that's something that you will have the opportunity to revisit. But that's pretty straightforward. The next part is a little less straightforward in that the census, when they do the count, isn't just a new count of every single person in the country. When they do that, they also change the census geography, which is how they report that data, because they don't report it household by household, because that would be violating people's individual confidentiality. They use what they call census blocks. And in California, in the last census, they had 700,000 of those. They deliberately try to consolidate those down to the much more reasonable 520,000. But those new census blocks don't always conform to new existing district boundaries. And when they don't conform, you have to make a change because you need to use those census blocks because they are really the Lego blocks we use for redistricting. And just like regular Lego blocks, you're not allowed to saw them in half. You have to use them as you get them. And we did have a problem here. And I'm going to draw your attention first to the map on the left with the blue lines. And you see 3 areas that are highlighted in purple, green, and orange. And those are actually 3 different census blocks. And you're seeing the parcel boundaries underneath them. And the blue lines are the district boundaries that were adopted. And you'll notice that in all 3 cases, those lines as adopted are no longer conforming to the census geography. And the problem is, and I'm making up a number, if the census said there were 600 people who lived in that purple block, they don't tell us how many lived on which side of the line. So because of that, since equal population is what's going to govern this process as we talk about it, you can't just say, oh, we're just going to leave that line where it is, because I can't tell you if those districts are of equal size. So what I've done, just so you can provide initial demographics, is conformed those district boundaries to that census geography, which are the red lines you see on the right. And that is not in any way, shape, form binding on the council. You can decide as we go forward, where do you want that geography to go? This was just so you can have some numbers, so you have a starting point. So just so everybody's clear on that, it's just for that purposes only. And so, you know, this is a kind of a unique circumstance where you do have this issue, because normally cities have the opportunity to tell the census where to put these census blocks in order to avoid these kinds of issues. It's a program called the Block Boundary Suggestion Project. To be clear, why didn't the city of San Ramon do this? It's because the Block Boundary Suggestion BBSP was going on in 2016, and you didn't know you were going to have district lines, let alone where your district boundaries would be. So that is just, this is kind of a hangover, for lack of a better term, from the CVRA conversion. It's not something that I would expect to pop up during your next redistricting in 2031, but it is a complication for this process. And so what you'll see here is on the left, those were the lines that we actually adopted. So when I left you a few years ago, that's what we had on the left. When I refer to statistics on the demographics of your existing districts, it's not what you see on the left. It's what you see on the right, which reflects both the annex and the best attempt to conform to that census geography. So one way or another, we're going to have to make some changes to deal with those issues. But just so we're clear, when I go to the future slides and start showing you demographics, what we're talking about as we go forward. So there are those demographics. And what you see is that, and I'm sure it's no shock to you that there has in particular been disproportionate growth in District 3, which should not be surprising. So there is going to be, even if you're good with the annex, even if I put those split blocks in the right place, we would still have to do changes to at least balance out that population between districts 3 and 4 in particular. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is these two numbers. And it's something we'll talk about in a moment, but one concept that's important is the idea of a total deviation. And total deviation is just the difference between your largest district and your smallest district. So in this case, it would be about 24%. Generally, 10% is kind of one of the big markers we keep an eye on, and you're obviously beyond that marker. So despite everything else, that would also be something we need to look at. The other number I would draw your attention to is under the citizen voting age population. You will see that districts 3 and 4 are both in that 54 to 55% range. We'll talk about that when we talk about some of the obligations that apply to compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. The only other thing on this slide, and I know I've drawn attention to a lot on the slide already, but is this last part, which is adjusted for incarcerated populations. This is a change from when you did the initial redistricting, or the initial districting rather, in that state law now requires cities that when you do this districting process, they take individuals who are incarcerated in state facilities and reassign them back to where they were before they were incarcerated. That doesn't have a big impact in San Ramon because you don't have a facility. If you're in a jurisdiction that did have a state facility, it can make a huge difference in the process. But because of all the things I talked about, the annex, the census block issues, and this incarcerated population number, if you were to Google what is San Ramon's population, you may well not get that number. It's not because I was, failed high school math or anything like that. It's because we're dealing with several adjustments to those numbers that we're having to account for and build into this. So just so folks know, if somebody comes up to you on the street and says, I looked on, X website and it says there's 84,000 people. Why are you saying there's 86? It's because there are these couple of extra complications we're having to deal with.
A quick question. Are county incarcerated redistributed back to the city of origin? Or just state?
So there's 3 different tiers. So for federal populations, they're actually just excluded from the count. For state incarcerated, they are reassigned to where they were incarcerated from, and counties are left where at where they are. And there's actually a program to try to assign those back to count for those at the time of incarcerate, at the time of the count.
Okay.
So 3 different tiers of stuff.
Okay.
Criteria. These are going to be very familiar to what you did. They've actually changed slightly, but the only thing that really significantly changed, besides changing some terminology around, is that they did put in a formal ranking order. So I'm going to go through these in the rough ranking of order. That doesn't mean that you just absolutely have to do 1, then you go on to 2, then you go on to 3. There is a balancing act. So you might have some population deviations, for example, to account for a community of interest, but it does give you, when there's a competing criteria, some ranking of which one of these is more important than the other. Equal population is usually pretty easy to understand, though I walked you through there are a couple nuances in just saying how many people there are. But equal population doesn't mean exactly the same. So we're not trying to get each of these districts to be exactly the same size, and the terminology in state laws substantially. And what that means is that where you have districts that aren't of exactly the same size, you want to have a reason why. So you want to be accomplishing some other goal that is one of these traditional redistricting criteria. And again, it's no longer considered a safe harbor, but a general safe rule to keep an eye on is that difference between that largest district and that smallest district within 10%, i.e. plus or minus 5% roughly. So that's something we're going to want to keep an eye on. Federal law focuses heavily on issues of race and ethnicity. and making sure that protected classes and folks who have sometimes had been challenged in their ability to engage in the democratic process, that their voting rights aren't diluted and they aren't excluded from the process. But it is a balancing act in that under federal law, race cannot be the predominant factor in the process. It has to be balanced with traditional race neutral criteria. And you can't make these other criteria I'm going to talk about subordinate to considerations of race. But at the same time, under the Federal Voting Rights Act, there are times you explicitly have to consider race, particularly, again, to avoid depriving a minority group of their opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. And that's when, again, I was referring to some of those demographics, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I get to those, there's two ways you can really run afoul of the Federal Voting Rights Act, one of which is cracking. So if you imagine those red dots on the map are a protected class, i.e. Asian Americans. If you see in the first example, you're splitting them up into multiple districts so that they don't have an opportunity to elect in any. The other idea is packing, where in that example, you're putting them all into one district where if they were distributed in a different way, they might be able to elect in two. So those are the issues that we're going to be keeping an eye on to make sure we're complying with federal law. So this is a map of the API community within San Ramon. This is probably in no way shocking to you that it is heavily concentrated in the eastern portion of the town. And so that's, and as you see, you do have two districts that are already over 50%. And 50% is one of those big markers of can a group constitute a majority in a district. So as we reconstitute those lines, we'll want to be keeping an eye on those issues, while again, making sure the process isn't being driven where race is the predominant factor. So if race and ethnicity is probably the most complicated part of redistricting, contiguity is one of the easiest. Every part of the district needs to be touching every other part of the district. So in that example on the right, you can see that purple district isn't touching, it's separate. So you can't connect the southeastern portion of town to the northwestern portion of town with nothing connecting them in between. Communities of interest. This is a key concept because often people say, well, why don't you just draw districts as squares? Just draw 4 squares. And the reality is because districting is about representing people. And people don't all live in neat squares, right? And in this example, you can see on the right, those 4 districts that look very neat and tidy may not be that neat and tidy if you imagine those red dots were a community. And what you've done is you've split it up into lots of different districts, so it can't have a voice in any. Community of interest under state law is defined as a population with common social or economic interests that should be in the same district for purposes of fair representation. That's a fancy way of saying, who do you go with? Who should you be voting with for purposes of defining who's on this body? And the key thing is there's no definitive database of this. I can't pull up a database of every community of interest in San Ramon. It does not exist. And so this is a key place where we can take advantage of this longer time period to solicit feedback from people who live in San Ramon about what those communities may be. Another concept here is understandable boundaries. Understandable boundaries is pretty understandable in that once we are done with this process, if somebody goes up to you and says, what are the boundaries of District 3? You should be able to describe those boundaries to them such that they know what the hell you're talking about. We're going up Main Street and then take hook and a right down the creek and blah, 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 right? That's all this is. And those boundaries may not, again, be squares. Topography is not to work that way. Mountains, hills, valleys, that's all the kind of stuff that just doesn't follow straight lines always. And those lines may be natural or artificial barriers, all the kinds of things we would be looking at. Compactness, and I promise we're almost done with this part of the program, is the shape look test. So this is when you look at something, and this is usually where that gerrymandering word comes up, when you start seeing weird shapes. Now, there might be justifiable reasons why you have weird shapes, because again, that's how people may live. But you want to look at that Importantly, state law does not favor abstract shapes, so it doesn't say draw squares, draw circles. What it does say is don't skip one population to go get a different population. So don't skip over group A to get it to group B, unless, again, you're looking at one of those higher ranked criteria. And again, I just mentioned gerrymandering. If you didn't know, this is the cartoon from which it comes. This is a district that was drawn in the 1800s in Massachusetts. And it's named after the governor at the time. Under state law, there's two important prohibitions on this, which are one, that law districts shall not be drawn to discriminate against a political party, and communities of interest, while they can be defined broadly, shall not be defined as a relationship with a party, incumbent, or candidate. So again, things to remember, we're trying to get districts of roughly equal size. That doesn't mean exactly. We need to look at those traditional redistricting criteria while making sure we're complying with federal law and still being careful not to use race as a predominant factor. So how are we going to actually physically do this? We have two key data sources. One is the census. The census is a head count that's done every 10 years, and it's literally designed to count every single person. And that's what its purpose is. And it's reported by the smallest geography the census uses, which are called census blocks. The other big data source we're going to use is the American Community Survey, or ACS. And as its name survey suggests, it is not intended to be a snap count of every single person in the country at a given time. Rather, every month, a portion of San Ramon is sent a survey from the federal government, which they fill out and return. The federal government in turn takes the 5-year average of those and reports those once every year. And that's where we get the data on that we use for the racial and ethnic data that's used for compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Normally that is only reported by census blocks, which are bigger than census block groups, which are bigger than census blocks, as you'll see. But California actually takes the extra step of breaking it down to those census blocks. So this is those census blocks, those green lines you see on the screen. So those are the building blocks we have to work with. And again, you're not allowed to saw a Lego block in half. And then you see those blue and red lines, which represent those block groups and those block tracks. The American Community Survey reports not only racial and ethnic data, but other questions. So if you asked at some point, where are the renters, for example, I might pull data from the American Community Survey, but it's only going to be available by that larger chunks of geography, which is, again, where public input is important in giving a much finer picture of the city. Now, 642 census blocks is a lot of Lego blocks to ask the public to keep track of if they want to participate in this process. So as a result, one of the things I do is I create what we call slices, which are these black lines you're seeing. They're based on that census geography, along with understandable boundaries within the city, and also your existing district plan. So this is designed for the sole purpose of facilitating the public should they want to submit their own redistricting plans. Now, importantly, for purposes of you drawing the lines, if one of these slices is one that you're like, hey, we want to actually split this to do whatever goal you're trying to accomplish, perfectly allowable. These are not binding on the process. The only limitation is if you did split a slice, you need to use the green lines. So we have to go back. So you can split those slices, but you can't split the census blocks. And you'll see how those slices work functionally in a moment. But again, just as a reminder, we're at the start of this process where we have 2 hearings before we draw maps, and then we'll have 2 hearings after we draw a map afterwards to actually look at maps and get you towards a final plan, which by state law must be adopted no later than April 17th. So that month gap between March 22nd and April 17th is on purpose. So we have a little cushion, just in case. For public input, and we're going to show those tools, there's 2 big ways the public can participate over the next few months in particular. One is by telling you, just simply answering, what is my community of interest? Because to be blunt, a lot of the members of the public don't care about this process. They don't care about necessarily how this body is formed and how it's elected. But they can tell you what their community is. They know what their neighborhood is. They know who they go together with. And they can answer that question so people who aren't even really interested in redistricting can contribute to the process. And then we also have these additional tools, which I'll show for people who are really into this and do want to suggest how these lines are drawn for the next 10 years. And with that, I'm going to switch over and quickly show you through some of the stuff that's on the website. And hopefully we're going to flip over here. And hopefully you're now seeing the redistricting website that we have up and running that staff has put together. And this is a whole host of resources available, which I'll just flip through. One is a set of what I call baseline maps. So these are all different ways to see the city. So for example, if you wanted to see the difference between what was voted on, then the annex, then dealing with the split block issue. If you want to see different ways to look at the city, some of these came up, for example, during the last redistricting process or the initial districting process, looking at, for example, enrollment zones, lots of different ways of looking at the city to kind of get those thoughts going. Again, for members of the public who want to just talk about what their community is, there's a simple one-pager that they can print out. There's a map of the city. They can draw that community on, describe their community, send it in, and they've contributed. There's also an online tool for describing how to do that process online. For the nerds who really want to draw district plans, here you see those slices that we talked about, and hopefully you can see how those are used, where somebody can print this, again, simple one-pager out. It's got the population count for each slice. You would add it up and draw a line on the map and say, this is District 1, this is District 2, this is District 3. What most people do then is pop out their smartphone, take a snapshot, and email it in. And then those plans will be digitized. Importantly, any plans that are submitted by the public, I treat just like I drew them myself. I'm going to show the exact same statistics, the exact same graphics to you. So you have the best thinking of not only myself, but the public as well. I'm going to quickly flip over here and show you there's also a tool that is an Excel tool for those of us who don't like adding up math and doing it that way. And that Excel tool, you can see here, you can go in and it has all the slices in there. And you can literally go in and say, I want slice 2 to be in District 2, and I want slice 2 to be in District 3, and 3 to be in 4, and so on. And it's just going to start adding up those numbers for you. Email it in, all you need to do, and we will take that and consider that as part of the process. And then going back to the website again. And we're almost done with me talking. If you're unclear on where those slices are, where those district boundaries fall, we have this interactive map where you can turn on the layers and zoom in and go look right down to the street and the house level exactly where these various existing boundaries are. And when we have district plans, we'll obviously start adding those up so people will be able to look at those in detail. So with that, mercifully, I'm going to stop talking and be available to answer questions if there are any from council or the public. And then also if there's any direction on anything amongst all the things I already showed you that we left out that you also want for the part of the process, then we can make sure we start working on those for the next hearing.